Michael never thought he'd be going on a blind date at 60. He had been married once, divorced for over a decade, and had settled into a life of comfort. His days were simple. He enjoyed golfing, reading, traveling, and catching up with his old friends. Relationships weren't something he chased anymore. He had a few casual dates here and there, but nothing ever stuck. He wasn't necessarily against love, but he wasn't actively looking for it either. But his best friend Richard insisted that he meet Sandra. "She's perfect for you," Richard had said. "She's smart, independent, and doesn't play games. Give it a shot. What's the worst that could happen?" Michael had heard those words before, and they rarely ended well. But after weeks of Richard's pestering, he agreed. A casual dinner. Just one evening. If nothing else, maybe he'd make a new friend. He arrived at the restaurant a few minutes early, dressed in a navy blazer over a light blue button-down. He wanted to make a good impression, but didn't want to overdress and make it look like he was trying too hard. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to keep an open mind. A few minutes later, Sandra walked in. She was well put together, shoulder-length auburn hair, elegant but not flashy, and confident. Michael appreciated confidence. They exchanged pleasantries, and at first everything seemed pleasant enough. They talked about their backgrounds, where they grew up, their careers, the usual small talk. Sandra had been married once as well, divorced for almost 8 years. She had built a solid life for herself, working as a business consultant and traveling frequently. Michael was starting to think Richard may have been onto something. But then, as they browsed the menu, Sandra set her fork down, took a sip of water, and leaned in slightly. "I don't like wasting time, so I want to be upfront about my expectations," she said. Michael blinked. That was direct. "Sure," he said, folding his hands on the table. "I believe in traditional relationships," she continued, "and that means a man should be the provider. If I'm with someone, I expect him to handle all the financial responsibilities, bills, vacations, daily expenses, everything. I don't split things in relationships. That's just not how I was raised." Michael had to take a moment to process that. It wasn't that he couldn't afford to pay for things. He was financially secure. But the expectation that he would fully support someone he had just met, that rubbed him the wrong way. "That's a strong stance," he said carefully. "So are you saying you wouldn't contribute financially at all?" Sandra shook her head. "I'm independent in other ways. I bring value in different aspects. Emotional support, making a house a home, making sure my man is taken care of. I don't believe a woman should have to stress about money. A real man provides for his woman." Michael took a slow sip of his drink, keeping his expression neutral. "I respect that you know what you want," he said finally. "But do you think it's fair to expect someone to take on that responsibility entirely?" Sandra shrugged. "A man who truly values a woman wouldn't even question it." Michael exhaled slowly. This was only the first expectation, and already alarm bells were ringing in his head. He believed in balance, both partners bringing something to the table. He didn't mind treating a woman, but to be expected to handle everything? That didn't sit right with him. He reminded himself to keep an open mind. Maybe this was just one thing she felt strongly about. Maybe there was room for discussion. "So," he said, shifting slightly in his seat, "what else is important to you in a relationship?" Sandra leaned back slightly, as if preparing for her next statement. "I don't believe in men having female friends," she said firmly. Michael raised an eyebrow. "None at all?" "Number, I don't believe men and women can ever be just friends. It always leads to something else, or there's always an underlying attraction. If I'm in a relationship, I expect my man to cut off all female friendships. No exes, no female coworkers outside of work, no old friends. If I'm your woman, I should be the only woman in your life." Michael blinked. He had known people who felt this way before, but hearing it so bluntly made him uncomfortable. "I have quite a few female friends," he said. "Some of them I've known for decades. You're saying I'd have to cut them all out?" "Yes," Sandra said without hesitation. "If we're serious, there's no reason for you to have any other women in your life. I don't do that whole just friends thing." Michael felt his jaw tighten. "What about professional relationship?" he asked. "I still do consulting work occasionally. I work with women sometimes. Is that a problem?" As long as it's purely work-related and there's no unnecessary communication outside of that, then it's fine, she said. But I don't believe in casual friendships with the opposite sex. It's disrespectful to your partner. Michael took another slow sip of his drink. He had always believed trust was the foundation of a relationship. He had female friends who were like family to him, people who had been there for him through different stages of life. The idea of cutting them off just to prove loyalty to someone didn't sit right with him. Still, he kept his tone calm. And this is non-negotiable? Sandra nodded. Absolutely. Michael inhaled deeply, setting his glass down. He was already starting to get the feeling that this wasn't going to work out. But Sandra wasn't done. There's something else I need to be clear about, she said, her expression serious. Michael braced himself. I believe in full transparency in a relationship, she continued. That means sharing phone passwords, daily check-ins, and letting each other know where we are at all times. There should be no secrets between us. Michael stared at her, now genuinely stunned. You mean you want access to my phone? He asked. Yes, Sandra said. If there's nothing to hide, then there shouldn't be a problem. I expect full honesty, and I don't believe in keeping things private in a committed relationship. I would share everything with you, and I expect the same in return. Michael let out a small chuckle, though it wasn't because he was amused. That's a lot, he said. So, no female friends, full financial responsibility, and now full access to my personal phone and daily whereabouts? Yes, Sandra said matter-of-factly. If we're serious about commitment, this is what it takes. I don't do half measures. Michael nodded slowly, feeling a mix of disbelief and frustration. He had never been in a relationship where someone demanded this much control. He had gone into this date expecting an interesting conversation. Instead, he was feeling like he had stepped into an interrogation disguised as a relationship contract. He took a slow breath, deciding whether or not to continue this conversation. Sandra, however, wasn't finished yet. There's one last thing I need to be upfront about, she said, looking directly at him. Michael exhaled through his nose. This night just kept getting better and better. Michael adjusted his posture, feeling the weight of the conversation. He had gone on this date hoping for pleasant company and lighthearted conversation, but instead he felt like he was being handed a contract, one with strict terms and conditions that left little room for compromise. Sandra had already laid out her 3 demands. He would be financially responsible for everything. He would have to cut off all female friends, and he would need to give her full access to his phone, passwords, and daily whereabouts. He was already mentally checking out, but then she said it. There's one last thing I need to be upfront about. Michael, now more curious than hopeful, simply nodded. Go ahead. Sandra leaned in slightly. I believe in full commitment, and that means if we're going to be serious, we live together immediately. I don't do long distance. I don't do separate homes. If we're dating, we build a life together, under the same roof. Michael blinked. You mean move in together right away? He asked, his tone careful. Yes, she confirmed. I don't see the point in wasting time. I'm not interested in casual dating. At this stage in life, we either know what we want or we don't. If we work as a couple, I'd expect you to sell your house and move in with me. Michael's eyebrows lifted slightly. Sell my house? Sandra nodded again, as if she had thought this through entirely. Yes, I already have a home. I don't want to maintain 2 places. I need full commitment, and that means merging our lives immediately. Michael sat back in his chair, letting the words sink in. He could understand that at their age, neither of them had decades to waste figuring things out. But the idea of moving in together right away, without even getting to know each other first, felt extreme. And selling his house? That was an even bigger issue. I'm assuming there's no room for negotiation on this? He asked, trying to keep his voice light. Sandra shrugged. I'm open to adjustments, but the general expectation remains. I don't believe in separate lives when 2 people are committed. Michael exhaled, shaking his head slightly. I have to be honest, he said. That's a lot to process. Sandra tilted her head. Why? What's so hard to understand? If 2 people love each other, why wouldn't they want to live together? Michael paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I think living together makes sense, eventually, but right away, without even spending time learning about each other's habits, personalities, and lifestyles, That feels rushed. Sandra waved a hand dismissively. I've done the whole dating slowly thing before, and it never works. Either people are serious or they're not. Michael nodded slowly. He had seen this before. Some people mistook speed for commitment, as if moving in together quickly somehow guaranteed a solid relationship. But in his experience, relationships built on forceful commitments instead of natural progression never lasted. Still, he tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. And what if things don't work out? He asked. Where do I live if I've already sold my house? Sandra smiled slightly. Why would you assume it won't work out? Michael exhaled through his nose. That wasn't exactly an answer. Sandra tapped her fingers lightly on the table. I just don't see the point in keeping separate lives. It's about trust and commitment. If you don't want to take that step, it means you're not fully invested. Michael took another sip of his drink, feeling the weight of everything she had just laid out. This wasn't just about different relationship preferences. This was about control. Every demand she had made so far had one thing in common. She wanted full access, full dependency, and full control. And Michael, he wasn't that kind of man. But before he could say anything, Sandra continued. I don't believe in independence in relationships, she added. When two people are together, their lives should merge completely. That's how love works. Michael smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. I think love also includes respecting each other's space. Sandra shook her head. Not in my book. At that moment, Michael knew. This wasn't going to work. He had tried to keep an open mind. He had listened. He had given her the space to express what she wanted, and he had tried to see if there was any room for compromise. But the more she spoke, the more he realized that this wasn't about partnership. It was about ownership. He wasn't looking for a contract. He wasn't looking to be controlled. And he definitely wasn't looking to hand over his entire life to someone he had just met. Michael set his glass down, looking at Sandra with a polite but firm expression. That's a lot to take in, he said. And I appreciate your honesty. But I have to say, I don't think we're looking for the same kind of relationship. Sandra's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? Michael sighed. I respect what you want, but I don't think I can meet those expectations. I'm looking for a relationship where two people grow together, not where one person dictates how everything should be. Sandra scoffed lightly. So you're saying you can't commit? Michael shook his head. I'm saying I want a partnership, not a set of rules to follow. Sandra folded her arms. And what exactly is wrong with my expectations? Michael smiled slightly. Nothing, if that's what you truly want. But they're not right for me. Sandra stared at him for a long moment, and Michael could tell she wasn't used to hearing no. Finally, she sighed and leaned back. Well, at least you're honest. Michael chuckled. I try to be. Sandra exhaled, then shrugged. Fair enough. I guess we're just not a match. Michael nodded. That's okay. Not everyone is. And just like that, the tension melted slightly. There was no shouting, no dramatic exit, just two people who had realized they wanted completely different things. But even as they sat there, finishing their drinks, Michael knew one thing for sure. This was the strangest blind date of his life, and he was more than ready to get out of there. Michael glanced at his watch. It wasn't that he had anywhere urgent to be, but he was already mentally preparing his exit strategy. Sandra, meanwhile, seemed entirely unfazed, sipping her drink as if she hadn't just presented a four-part relationship ultimatum. I have to say, she said, her voice casual, I didn't expect you to react this way. Michael raised an eyebrow. How did you think I'd react? Sandra shrugged. Most men my age say they want a serious relationship, but when a woman actually knows what she wants, they run. Michael smiled politely, but inside he was thinking, that's because what you want sounds more like a hostage situation than a relationship. But he wasn't about to argue. I think it's great that you're clear about your expectations, he said diplomatically. It's just a matter of finding someone who shares the same views. Sandra nodded slowly, studying him. So let me ask you this. What exactly are you looking for? Michael exhaled, leaning back slightly. He hadn't really thought about it in strict rules or demands the way Sandra had, but he knew one thing for sure. Partnership, he said. I want someone who adds to my life, not takes over it. Someone I can enjoy time with, without feeling like I have to change everything about myself to make them happy. Sandra tapped her fingers on the table. So you don't want commitment? Michael chuckled. Commitment and control aren't the same thing. Sandra smirked. Sounds like you just want to keep your freedom. Michael took a slow sip of his drink. And what's wrong with that? Sandra sighed, shaking her head. See, this is the problem with men today. You all want relationships on your terms, but can't handle a woman with standards. Michael smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Standards are fine. Restrictions are another thing entirely. Sandra didn't seem to have a response for that. The silence stretched between them for a moment before she finally exhaled and reached for her purse. Well, I guess there's no point in dragging this out then. Michael suppressed a sigh of relief. Finally, she motioned for the check, and when the waiter arrived, Michael instinctively reached for his wallet. But before he could pull out his card, Sandra stopped him. Oh no, you're paying, she said with a smirk. After all, that's your role as the man, isn't it? Michael let out a small laugh, shaking his head as he handed his card over to the waiter. He had no problem paying for dinner, but somehow, this particular moment felt like a final test. One last chance for Sandra to remind him of the life he had narrowly escaped. He waited for the receipt, signed it, and then stood up, offering Sandra a polite nod. Well, this was interesting. Sandra smirked again. You'll regret this, you know. You'll see that I was offering you something real. Michael chuckled. Or I'll sleep peacefully knowing I dodged a bullet. Sandra rolled her eyes, but Michael didn't wait for a response. He gave a quick goodbye and walked out, stepping into the cool evening air. He let out a deep breath, feeling the tension finally leave his shoulders. As he drove home, Michael couldn't help but reflect on the night. It wasn't just about Sandra. It was about how people approach relationships differently, some with openness and flexibility, others with rules and restrictions. He wasn't against commitment. He wasn't afraid of relationships, but he was smart enough to know that love wasn't about setting ultimatums. It was about finding someone who fit naturally into your life, not someone who demanded you reshape everything to fit theirs. Sandra wasn't a bad person. She just had a very specific idea of what she wanted, one that Michael had no interest in fulfilling. And that was okay. Not every date had to lead somewhere. Sometimes they were just a lesson. And this one? This was a lesson he wouldn't forget anytime soon.